The Europeans chose to dominate and colonize at a time when the world economy was doing well. When they colonized, the Europeans got new resources and new markets to help boost their economies. This caused a huge economic boom in the world market. Americas and other dominated places couldn't break free from the European dependence at first because of the needs of goods from them. Europe fully conquered the world economy instead of Chinese and Mongols in the Middle East. This was the first domination of the New World. Britain came out on top. They had more markets and resources because they had more colonies.
Here's a recap of the period of 1450 to 1750 going by empire, starting with the gunpowder empires. In contrast to the sea-based empires developing in Europe, land-based empires remained the dominant political form in other parts of the Eastern Hemisphere. The area between 1450 and 1750 saw the appearance of several land-based empires who built their power on the use of gunpowder. The Ottomans, the Safavids in Southwest Asia, the Mughals in India, the Ming, and the Qing in China, and the new Russian Empire. All had huge land armies armed with guns. These empires developed relatively independently from Western influence, and to some extent they counterbalanced the growth of European power and colonization. An important consequence of the appearance of gunpowder empires was their conquest of most nomadic groups. Since the nomads had less access to guns, the empires were finally able to conquer and subjugate them, and many areas of direct relations among states or merchant groups replaced nomadic intermediaries for international contact. For example, European kings invited diplomats from other countries to join their courts, and China also received foreign representatives. Muslim empires. In the previous era, the political power of Muslim lands had been crushed by Mongol invasions in the 13th century and those of Timur, a Central Asian of Mongol descent, in the 14th century. These new empires, the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal, rose between 1450 and 1750, and collectively they supported a new flowering of Islamic civilization. However, competition between them also led to important political divisions and military clashes. All three originated in the Turkic, nomadic cultures of the Central Asian steppe, and they all had absolute monarchs who modeled their courts on those of earlier Islamic dynasties. Although each of the Muslim empires had their own special problems, they faced some similar ones that eventually led to their decline. The Ming and early Qing dynasties in China. The Ming emperors continued to rule China until the mid-1600s, but the dynasty was in decline for many years before that. Although its cultural brilliance and economic achievements continued until about 1600, China had some of the same problems and the Muslim empires had. Borders difficult to guard, armies expensive to maintain, and transportation and communication issues. The early Qing dynasty. The Ming dynasty was finally overthrown in 1644 by the Manchus, a northern power that had previously helped Ming emperors fight the Mongols and Japanese. The Manchus turned on the Ming once they discovered how weak the empire was, and they called themselves the Qing, pure empire, because they saw themselves as restoring China to glory. However, the Manchu were seen by some as not being truly Chinese because they were northern people from the outside, just as the Mongols had been almost for 4 centuries. The Qing dynasty was to rule China until 1911, and in the years before 1750, the empire was very strong. The empires ruled under many of the same precepts that China had always had, such as the mandate of heaven, which they saw as justification for their takeover. The Manchu did not keep their ethnic identity, forbidding intermarriage between Manchus and Chinese. They also outlawed the Chinese from learning the Manchurian language, and they required Chinese men to shave their heads and grow long keys at the back of their heads as a sign of submission. Chinese contact with Europeans. East-west contacts between China and Europe intensified during the early Qing dynasty. One type of contact, Christian missionaries from the West, had probably come to China as early as the 7th century, but the plague and the collapse of the Yuan dynasty had all but stopped the interchange. Contact revived during the 16th century when the Jesuits first began arriving in China. The Jesuit priests were an order of Catholic Church that specialized in international missionary work. One of the early Jesuits, Matteo Ricci, very much impressed the Chinese, who admired his education, brilliance, and respect for Chinese customs and accomplishments. The Jesuits dazzled their hosts with European science and technology. For example, they were able to use their math skills to correct Chinese calendars that up until then had miscalculated solar eclipses. They prepared maps of the world and charmed the Chinese with gadgets like chiming clocks, and the emperors saw to it that Jesuits had a special place in their courts. However, they had limited success in converting people to Christianity. After the Pope condemned what he called ancestry worship, Kangxi ordered the end to Jesuit ministries. Tokugawa Japan. A gunpowder empire emerged in Japan, unusual in the sense that Japan was not land-based. The Japanese daimyos, or regional lords, had operated fairly independently from the shoguns before the early 17th century, when these military, feudalistic leaders were unified under one powerful family, the Tokugawa. The emperor was still honored as a ceremonial leader, as reflected in the name given to the Tokugawa government, the Bakufu, or the tent government that temporarily replaced the emperor. The tent government eventually settled in Edo, modern Tokyo, and ruled their independent subjects by instituting alternate attendants, the practice of daimyo spending every other year at the Tokugawa shogun's court. This requirement meant that daimyos had limited time to focus on building armies back home, and they also had to maintain expensive second homes in Edo. The Russian Empire. By the time of the golden age of the Qing dynasty, the Russian Empire had expanded all the way from its origins in Eurasia east to the Pacific coast. There they came into border conflicts with the Chinese, but they also shared the problem of attack by Mongols and other nomadic people of Central Asia. However, Russian Tsar Peter the Great, who ruled Russia during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, cast his eyes in the other direction toward Europe for guidance in strengthening his own growing empire. Russia's early days had been shaped by the Byzantine Empire, and when the Byzantines' power faded, so did that of the early Russian Tsars. Before Peter's rule, Russians had almost no contact with Europe, and their lack of access to warm water ports crippled their ability to participate in the maritime revolution. The feudalistic political and economic structure meant that Tsars had trouble containing the boyars, or Russian nobility, who often plotted against them. Partly because of this threat, the Tsars practiced absolutism, with the power of the Tsar backed by divine right granted by the Russian Orthodox Church. Peter's Russia was a vast, cold empire with almost no infrastructure, no navy, a limited army, very few decent roads, and few warm water ports. Last is the African kingdoms. In 1450, Africa was a diverse continent with a blend of large civilizations, city-states, rural villages, and hunter and gatherer societies. Many people in the north, sub-Saharan and eastern coastline areas were Muslim, but many native religions remained quite strong.